Uncovering History, the Founding Fathers and Those in Their Shadows. Part 7, The Battle for New York and John Glover, the Unsung Hero. American spirits were high after an official break from the mother country became clear with the publishing of the Declaration of Independence. When Washington arrived in New York City on horseback, which people loved, he was met with cheers and gun salutes from multiple regiments and everyday people. Washington almost always rode in a coach, but at the edge of the city or town, he would mount his horse and ride into town like the common folk. After arriving, he took a copy of the Declaration of Independence and read it aloud. This meant that the people of America had a distinct sense of direction why they would willingly enter into battle to fight for the newly born country. The Americans that decided to join the cause, however, had reached the point of no return as they were now deemed as traitors by the mother country. One British judge stated what should be done to an Irish rebellion that took place some years before that because they were traitors. You ought to be drawn on hurdles to the place where you are to be executed and hanged by the neck, but not until you're dead. For while you are still living, your bodies are to be taken down and your bowels torn out and burned before your eyes, your heads then cut off and your bodies divided, each into 4 full quarters. This type of language, while intimidating, could not have deterred the rebels after hearing Washington speak of freedom. Many, after hearing the new document read that clearly delineated a break from Britain, went to the center of the city where a 2-ton statue of King George stood. It was quickly toppled and decapitated, followed by the cutting off of the nose and eyebrows, which Washington denounced. Being made out of lead, the remainder of the statue was brought out of town and melted into some 42,000 musket balls that would be used against the British. Ebenezer Hazard wrote, "The statue has been pulled down to make musket balls, so his troops will probably have melted majesty fired at them." Having previously won several victories along with the securing of Boston, New York City was now in the crosshairs for General Washington, Congress, and the British as the most imperative city for securing victory and winning the war. While 3 months earlier, Howe and the British fleet had evacuated Boston, heading north to Halifax, it was still a well-established fact that they would return, prompting many men, women, and children to flee the city. Prior to the rebels securing New York, there were about 25,000 inhabitants and growing, but that number dwindled by some 5,000, leading up to a certain collision with Howe and the British. The dilemma that the Americans now faced was protecting a city surrounded by water and waterways from an amphibious assault by the superior British naval force. In fact, many of Washington's own officers conceded that whoever commanded the sea controlled New York. In preparations for an imminent British naval and land attack, Washington ordered the fortification of the city by digging numerous trenches along many of the coasts along with redoubts. He also ordered multiple blockades on any street near the waterfront. This was done to potentially prevent the British Navy from freely sailing up the Hudson. Washington also ordered the building of 2 forts perched on rocky hills, Fort Washington and Fort Lee. And by early June, Washington had some 120 cannons ready and aimed to demolish the British fleet. While both knowing and being warned by many loyalists that the British would arrive at any hour, the rebels were indeed still awestruck and taken back when a fleet of some 120-plus British naval ships carrying General William Howe were spotted offshore on the morning of June 29, 1776. That Saturday morning, General Henry Knox was enjoying breakfast with his wife Lucy when he was suddenly informed of the British arrival. Knox said, "You can scarcely conceive of the distress and anxiety." He wrote his brother, "The city is in an uproar, the alarm guns firing, the troops repairing to their post. My God, may I never experience the like feelings again." As the ships approached, it must have been an intimidating sight, as one onlooker stated that nearly all of London was afloat. Soon, some 40% of the British naval fleet would descend upon New York. This was the expectation Howe desired, as he peered off the main deck of the Greyhound as more ships gently glided into the bay and his men disembarked onto Staten Island. Soon after, William Howe's brother Richard, the commander of the Royal Navy, would also arrive from England with more ships carrying some 17,000 Hessian mercenaries, bringing a total of 32,000 soldiers, grenadiers, and mercenaries to crush the American rebellion. This was the single largest military expedition the country had ever seen. So whatever confidence the Americans had prior to the British arrival was now dashed by this most impressive show of strength. The Hessians were particularly worrisome for the Americans, as they were highly trained, ruthless killing machines who fought far better than any British regular. One soldier said, "O Britain, how is it that you would hire foreigners to slit your children's throats?" Upon receiving a very accurate summary of the British numbers from General Nathaniel Greene, Washington quickly dispatched a huge quantity of orders to prepare for battle. Washington, however, didn't seem that impressed by the sheer magnitude of the British army when he logged in his diary, "We do not fear Tory George or his war-torn army. We fear them not." To one of his overseers, Washington said, "They are in possession of an island only. This is but a small step towards the conquest of this continent." It was shortly after this that Washington would greatly encourage his army when he said to them, "The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be freemen or slaves. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. Let us therefore animate and encourage each other, and show the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth." As Rick Atkinson correctly stated, General Howe had an answer for the Declaration of Independence. But before Howe and the British struck, there was an ominous event that took place in New York on August 21st of 1776, the eve of the battle. A storm of such power and sheer magnitude hit the city that it lit up the entire night sky. One onlooker said that it had seemed as if the heavens had opened up, as the skies were as black as ink. 2 men were actually directly struck during the storm, and it was reported that their bodies were completely charred. It was so bad that the points of their swords melted along with the coins in their pockets. Was this a sign of things to come? This didn't deter the British, as the next morning, General Howe, along with 5 military ships loaded with soldiers and protected by 2 ships with 61 guns, made landfall on the shores of Long Island. Within 10 minutes, some 4,000 British soldiers unloaded from the boats as they splashed onto the shore, quickly falling into formation. After a few hours' time, over 15,000 British soldiers and Hessians had safely landed on the island and were ready for battle. As American spies watched this event unfold, this must have been an enormous shift in momentum, as the British now seemed to hold a commanding presence of strength and power as they marched in sequence with their bayonets shimmering in the sun. From the outset and prior to the British attack, the Americans seemed deeply confused, troubled, and almost destined to fail. Nathaniel Greene, who was Major General in New York, was struck with a fever so severe that he was confined to his bed. Greene said he barely had enough energy to get out of bed and write to Washington, prompting Washington to replace him with the inept General John Sullivan. Because Sullivan could not get the soldiers in order or equipped for battle, Washington then quickly replaced him with the rugged Israel Putnam. There was even an accident involving the misfiring of an American cannon that killed 6 men, blowing them into pieces. Under Colonel Alexander Hamilton, to add insult to injury, Washington's army was also decimated by disease that ravaged the camps, as his once 10,000 men strong had dwindled to about half of that by the time the British were ready to attack. One Tory wrote that the stench from the sick men in the city was so putrid that you couldn't turn a corner without smelling sickness. Not knowing precisely where the British would attack, Washington then hedged his bets and split the army into 2 separate companies, potentially weakening them severely. As the attack broke out between the rebels and the British at Guan Heights, the Americans fired 2 of their cannons from the higher ground directly at the oncoming British. However, Howe's men responded with such tremendous cannon force from 12-pound cannonballs and grape shot that limbs and parts of Continental soldiers were being blown off almost regularly. One eyewitness said that an incoming cannonball struck the skull of a soldier, and he didn't so much as even groan or wince as his lifeless body fell to the ground. As the two sides closed in on one another, a very good gunshot volley began. In trademark British style, one regiment fired their muskets while another rose from behind them and likewise fired. One of the reasons for standing in groups of men and not relying on cover was because of the inaccuracy of the musket ball. The musket was a terribly inaccurate weapon beyond 30 to 50 yards, so a group of men shooting in a cluster was more likely to knock down the enemy. In a surprising turn of events, the Americans held their ground, and for the first 2 hours, they were surprisingly able to push the British back some 200 yards. What was especially impressive about this initial encounter was that the Americans were able to go toe-to-toe with the British without using guerrilla warfare tactics and seemingly win. As a second wave of British soldiers arrived, accompanied with some 5,000 Hessians, they began to move towards the Americans. Yet again, they were repelled and held back. Now poised for another attack, the Americans were ready with their guns cocked, looking south for the enemy, but they were looking the wrong way. Henry Clinton, a British general, had spent many years in New York and was quite familiar with the terrain and topography. Clinton, along with Cornwallis, had devised a bait-and-switch plan for the American forces, leading them to believe that another squadron of men were heading directly towards them, while they were instead about to be flanked and caught completely by surprise. Using the cover of night and being almost completely silent, a British regiment, along with General Howe, Charles Cornwallis, and Henry Clinton traveled some 10 miles behind the American lines. That morning, when the Americans woke, they were hemmed in on every side with the British on their flank, in front of them, and on their rear. Almost immediately, the Americans fled in retreat as the British and Hessian forces pounced on them with ease. It was actually reported that when the bluecoats of the Hessians were spotted, the rebels began to retreat without even putting up a fight. One Hessian mercenary was utterly speechless, as he could not believe the Americans were giving the British so many problems. The entire event soon turned into a complete disaster, as the American soldiers, comprising young teenage boys, farmers, hat makers, wig makers, and old men with absolutely zero military knowledge, hid wherever they could under piles of leaves and trees as they were being hunted down. Some of the Americans, fleeing for their lives, retreated towards the British lines and away from the Hessians for the fear they had of them. As some rebels were captured by the Hessians, they were treated mercilessly. One soldier that surrendered to the Hessians was bayoneted in the chest and belly, another had his head cut off and stuck on a stump, and yet more were stabbed to death and stuck to trees with bayonets. There were pockets of rebel resistance as the Americans fled to Brooklyn Heights, coming to a crossing only to realize that another trap had been set and the path blocked. One such individual was Lord Alexander Stirling. While being outnumbered by 6,000 British soldiers, he managed to gather together about 1,000 men to charge the British in Cornwallis. As they charged the British, a significant number of them were cut down. Upon retreating, they gathered enough courage to charge again, only to be massacred for a second time. After several hours of battle from these uncoordinated charges, scarcely a single shot or two could be heard from the Americans. There was another small group of American soldiers from Maryland under Sir William Smallwood who had never seen battle and were trying their best to hold off some of the British to provide an escape route for Stirling and the remainder of his men. While they fought valiantly, of the some 400 of them, only 140 survived. "Good God," Washington proclaimed as these men were slaughtered. Washington, who was in Brooklyn Heights with the other regiment, surveyed the carnage through his telescope. Once victory had been decisively decided, American soldiers' dead bodies littered the battlefield, and those that were wounded and incapable of escape were shown no mercy and impaled by Hessian bayonets. The Americans had suffered a severe beating and defeat by the superior British forces. Much of the blame for the lopsided defeat fell back onto General Washington and his subordinates. This was exactly how the British envisioned their victory over amateurs, putting the American rebels back into their proper place. John Adams famously opined, "In general, our generals have been out-generaled." A British newspaper called Washington a bungling beginner. General Howe and his men could now taste victory, and with one more attack, they could permanently extinguish the inferior American forces for good. But in an interesting turn of events, Howe held his men back from finishing off the Americans. After the war, when General Howe stood before Parliament and stated why he didn't finish off the American forces, Howe said that while he could have taken the redoubt where the Americans were, he didn't want to press the action any further so as to prevent additional unwarranted casualties of British soldiers. The Howe brothers imagined that they could soon finish off Washington and his men by surrounding them on land with infantry and hemming them in by sending ships up the East River. In a fortunate turn of events, Washington and his men were saved by weather, as wet, rainy weather drenched everything for days, preventing a British attack. However, the British were slowly squeezing the clamp on the Continental Army as they inched closer and closer to Washington and his men each day. In an emergency meeting, Washington gathered together with his generals and decided that a complete retreat was the only way the war would be prolonged, and a mass evacuation of Long Island across the East River to Manhattan was the only viable option. With some 9,000 sick and beaten up men, Washington wanted to cross that night and finish the crossing before sunrise. No one other than the generals and officers were to know what was going to take place, so the soldiers were left oblivious as to what was happening. Washington and his army would have never successfully crossed the East River had it not been for the services of John Glover of the Marblehead Regiment, thus ending the war in the existence of America, as Washington's army was outnumbered 6-1. Little is known about John Glover, a Massachusetts native, when the Revolutionary War is discussed, as he, among many others, stand in the shadows of our country's founders. When the Revolution began, Glover was 43 years old and had accumulated a sizable fortune. A fisherman by trade, Glover owned a substantial number of vessels and didn't need to involve himself in the revolution against Britain. But like so many other common folks, Glover believed in freedom and the American dream. So on August 29th, Washington ordered General Heath to retrieve every flat-bottomed boat fit for transportation and readied by that evening. Colonel Glover and his regiment, made up of freed blacks and fishermen, took possession of the boats and commenced the evacuation of Long Island. Because of torrential rains and a high tide, the currents were terribly difficult to navigate, but with muffled oars and strong oarsmen from Glover's regiments, the boats began the crossing. By the time midnight rolled around, the wind ceased and the tide had turned, giving the men a smoother transition across the river. Because the boats carried horses, men, and heavy artillery, at times the boats were just inches above the water. As the sun began to rise that morning, the Americans needed to hurry. Again, perhaps from divine providence, a dense fog rolled in that was so thick, one soldier said you couldn't see 6 yards ahead. However, as the fog began to lift, the British caught on to the American scheme and began to open fire on the last remaining boats. Washington, who swore he would not cross until the last man was loaded onto a boat, kept his word as the redcoats became visible, firing upon the boats. After 13 long, grueling hours, John Glover and his men successfully saved Washington and the army from certain defeat.